For so many of us, the story of the Great War ends neatly in November 1918. The armistice is signed, cheering crowds fill the streets, and supposedly the world just goes back to normal. But as we'll see in this explainer, the end of World War I didn't just stop a conflict. It actively shaped a century of atrocity, fragile peace, and human rights crises. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the cinematic history of this era, exploring rich historical imagery, maps, and the key vocabulary of a world desperately trying to rebuild itself from the ashes. So, when the guns fall silent, does the war truly end? Well, the short answer is no. The unprecedented violence of the Great War extended way beyond the muddy trenches of the Western Front. It wasn't simply a matter of putting away weapons and going home. The staggering scale of the conflict fundamentally fractured societies, it unleashed dark political movements, and it planted the very real seeds for future global tragedies. The guns may have fallen silent in Europe, but the shockwaves, they were just beginning to crest across the globe.
To really understand these shockwaves, we have to begin our timeline in the weakened Ottoman Empire. Let's look at our first key vocabulary term, a nationalist faction. By the time World War I broke out, the empire had already suffered decades of territorial losses, especially their defeat in the Balkan Wars. So in this incredibly weakened state, a fiercely nationalist faction known as the Committee of Union and Progress took control. Led by powerful figures like Talat Pasha, this regime began to view the diverse makeup of their own empire not as a normal historical reality, but as a fatal flaw.
And this brings us to another critical concept, a security liability. These leaders ruthlessly leveraged the chaos of a global war. They looked at the Armenian Christian minority, a population mostly concentrated near the Russian border, and officially labeled them as a political threat, a security liability. They used the dense, chaotic fog of the First World War as a deliberate cover for a meticulously planned campaign of ethnic elimination. It wasn't just battlefield violence. It was a calculated, bureaucratic decision made in the shadows. This horrific planning directly led to April 24, 1915, a date solemnly mourned today as Armenian Remembrance Day. It started in Constantinople, where authorities rounded up and arrested about 250 Armenian intellectuals and community leaders. From there, Talat Pasha ordered mass, systematic deportations. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians were forced from their homes and pushed onto brutal death marches, heading deep into the Syrian desert near Deir ez-Zor. 1,500,000. The sheer scale of this atrocity is just absolutely staggering. During these forced marches, between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians perished, and they didn't just die in crossfire. They were deliberately subjected to starvation, extreme exposure to the elements, and targeted violence. Historians today recognize this organized mass killing as one of the 20th century's very first modern genocides. For the people who miraculously survived this systematic violence, there was virtually nothing left to return to. They were scattered across the globe, fleeing to France, the United States, and throughout the broader Middle East. This massive displacement created what we call a diaspora. This is an incredibly resilient, global community that persists to this very day, holding on to their history and demanding recognition for what their ancestors endured. Okay, let's fast forward a bit to 1919, to the Paris Peace Conference, and see how this all builds into the broader global aftermath. Imagine this scene for a second. The grand, opulent halls of Versailles, packed with delegates representing a totally shattered world. After 4 years of a devastating war that had slaughtered millions, world leaders arrived to face desperate, grieving populations. Everyone was demanding that this be the war to end all wars. They were tasked with nothing less than forging a lasting peace. No pressure, right? But here's the problem. They arrived with wildly clashing visions. On one side, you had France's Georges Clemenceau, who demanded maximum, devastating punishment for Germany to guarantee French security, which makes sense given how much of the war was fought on French soil. On the other side, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was pushing for this idealistic peace based on his famous 14 points. And caught right in the middle was Britain's David Lloyd George, who wanted to weaken Germany economically but was terrified of pushing them so hard it would provoke a future war. Now, Wilson's idealistic vision heavily emphasized this concept of national self-determination. The core idea here is pretty noble. Distinct groups of people should have the absolute right to form their own independent states and choose their own governments, rather than just being subjects of some sprawling empire. Beautiful idea on paper, for sure, but it was about to collide head-on with the highly punitive reality of the treaty they were actually hammering out behind closed doors. The resulting compromise was the Treaty of Versailles, and it featured the notorious war guilt clause, also known as Article 231.
This wasn't just a political statement, it was a harsh legal mechanism that forced Germany to shoulder the absolute entire blame for starting the global catastrophe. This single, highly controversial clause basically became the foundational justification for everything else they were about to inflict on the German nation.
And tied directly to that mandated guilt was a staggering financial penalty, $33 billion in reparations. To put that into perspective, this was an astronomically crushing debt to slap onto a defeated nation whose economy was already in ruins. The whole point was to keep Germany economically suppressed for generations, basically making sure they could never afford to wage war again. Furthermore, Germany suffered what the public widely viewed as profound national humiliation. I mean, they lost critical, resource-rich territory, handing Alsace-Lorraine back to France and giving up the Polish corridor. On top of that, their once mighty military was heavily restricted, capped at a mere 100,000 soldiers. The pride of a massive empire was being systematically dismantled by the stroke of a pen. While Germany was severely punished, the rest of the map of Europe completely fractured. This is what we call the dissolution of empire. The massive Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires utterly collapsed. From their ruins, the map was basically wiped clean and redrawn, birthing brand new nations across Eastern and Central Europe like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. But this drastic redrawing of the map extended far beyond Europe. Through a secret deal called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, drafted back in 1916, Britain and France had already decided to carve up the collapsing Ottoman Empire for themselves. They restructured the Middle East using this highly controversial mandate system. Essentially, they gave themselves the authority to govern these newly drawn territories, which was a massive betrayal to the local populations who'd been promised independence for their wartime support. So, to manage all of this incredibly fragile new geopolitical architecture, Woodrow Wilson championed the League of Nations. It was designed to ensure collective security, theoretically stopping another world war before it could even start. Yet, in a bitter twist of irony, the United States Senate absolutely refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Domestic politics kept America out entirely, leaving the very institution its own president designed inherently weakened from day one. There is a direct, undeniable chain reaction between that flawed peace and the darkness to come. The economic devastation and hyperinflation of the 1920s in Germany, driven in large part by those unpayable reparations we talked about, created a truly desperate populace. And this directly fueled the rise of fascism. An opportunistic ultranationalist named Adolf Hitler ruthlessly exploited German anger over the Versailles Treaty, weaponizing that war guilt clause to build a dictatorial regime. Meanwhile, over in the Middle East, that mandate system created entirely artificial borders. The lines drawn by diplomats in Paris completely ignored centuries-old ethnic and religious realities on the ground. By boxing historically rival groups together or just splitting cohesive communities apart, the peace treaty essentially guaranteed the ongoing instability that frankly dominates our news cycles even today. So how do we make sense of all these cascading horrors? Let's talk about one individual who tried. A brilliant Polish-Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin. As the dust of the First World War settled and the horrific details of the Armenian massacres became widely known, Lemkin realized that international law had a massive blind spot. There was literally no legal framework, not even a proper word, to describe the intentional, systematic destruction of a national or ethnic group. Horrified by what happened to the Armenians, and later forced to flee the Holocaust himself, Lemkin dedicated his entire life to fixing this blind spot. In 1944, he literally invented a new word to describe this ultimate crime. He took the Greek word genos, meaning race or tribe, and combined it with the Latin side, meaning killing, to create the word genocide. By giving it a name, he gave the international community the vocabulary it desperately needed to finally prosecute it. But if you look at this timeline, the arc of international justice was just agonizingly slow. It took over 30 years of relentless atrocities, from the start of the Armenian death marches in 1915, through the flawed peace of 1919, straight into the devastating outbreak of World War II in 1939. It was only after millions more had died that the world finally listened to Lemkin and ratified the UN Genocide Convention in 1948. Looking back at this heritage of history, the warning signs were flashing bright red the entire time. The deep political instability caused by economic ruin, the highly punitive treaties that bred desperate resentment, the unchecked ethnic eliminations hiding behind the fog of war. These were all glaring warning signs that world leaders in the 1920s and 30s just tragically failed to address until it was far, far too late. And because of those failures, the 20th century became a century of persistent turmoil. The nations born from those optimistic but deeply flawed peace treaties, places like Poland, the Baltic states, Yugoslavia, they struggled immensely. Along with the artificially divided Middle East, these regions faced a seemingly endless cycle of tension. The treaties of 1919 didn't really solve the world's problems, they just rearranged them into new, highly combustible configurations.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We often look at the news today and think of modern geopolitical conflicts as brand new problems. But when you look at the ethnic conflicts, the border disputes, and the human rights crises happening right now, ask yourself, how many of them are simply the unresolved echoes of 1919? The legacy of World War I isn't just sitting in a history book somewhere. It's the very foundation of the fragile peace we are still trying to maintain today. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.